Hello, and welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan, where I've been practicing law for 25 years in the fields of consumer protection and lemon law. I often write about this stuff for places like roadandtrack.com, and I've written a few books as well. Go to Amazon and look them up. Today we're going to talk about what you need to know about odometer fraud. What you need to know about odometer fraud. You know, this was much more common in the old days, but it does still happen despite the fact that every time I mention it on the internet, people argue with me and say, oh no, Steve, this doesn't happen anymore. Yes, it does. You need to know about it because it could happen to you. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, what I'm talking about is a thing on your dashboard that tells you how many miles your car has been driven. It's called an odometer. Looks like odometer, but it's an odometer. And in the old days, it used to be 6 numbers followed by a tenth number, a number for the tenths. So it's 6 digits of one color and then one off-colored last digit. And that would happen basically to roll your car up to 99,999.9 miles, and then it would roll over to 100,000. And of course, at 100,000, you'd lose the 1, you'd get all zeros again. So in the old days, if you bought a car that read 34,000 miles, it might have 134,000 miles on it. Somewhere along the line, during my lifetime, they added another digit. So now odometers can go to 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. And think about it. The reason they didn't do that in the old days is because cars didn't live that long. Okay, it was not uncommon for a car to die before it got to 100,000 miles in the old days. Nowadays, we routinely get them beyond that. My last Explorer, as you know, if you've watched many of these videos or listened to many podcasts of mine, my last Explorer made it to 237,000 miles and was still running when I sold it for scrap. It had issues, but its innards were still good. So in the old days, there was actually mechanical numbers, little dials. If you ever saw someone take apart a dashboard, you know that there was actually just little dials, little wheels with numbers on them. And in the old days, someone could actually, using not much more than a screwdriver and a couple other basic hand tools, remove the dashboard from the car, disconnect the stuff in the back, remove the dashboard, lay it face down on something, and then play with these dials and change the numbers. And that's where odometer fraud got started because, you know, in the old days, you had a car with 99,000 miles on it. If the odometer was spun back to, say, 29,000 miles, you could get a lot more money for it. Of course, that's illegal. And states passed laws on this, and the feds have passed laws against this as well. And one of the things I like to point out to people who've mentioned to me about how attractive the idea is that, you know, if I just had 50,000 miles disappear from my odometer, I could make a lot more money selling the car. It's a federal offense. It's a crime to roll an odometer back in America. And it's also a violation of many state laws. So for instance, in Michigan, if you spun an odometer back and they decided to prosecute you, they could under federal law or under state law. And it's a felony. It's a very serious crime. You almost never, however, hear anybody being prosecuted for it because the feds have more important things to do than chase around after people spinning odometers back at, you know, little used car lots or wherever. So the other concern we have, and we'll get back to the laws in a second because I'm a lawyer, we'll talk about the laws. But the other problem we have is that there have been recent changes in how the titles look in most states. So in the old days, you had a title for your car and you know you bought it with, say, 20,000 and you drove it to 99 and then somehow the odometer got rolled back to, say, 50. You could then put 50,000 miles on the title when you sold it and say that's actual mileage. And in the old days, there were actually just 2 boxes, actual or not actual mileage. And over time, that's evolved. And now they have things like actual mileage, mileage unknown or not actual. And then they'll often have one that says exceeds mechanical limits. And that is in recognition of the fact that when an odometer went over 100,000 miles in the old days, now it reads a number lower than what it actually is. So if your car had 129,000 miles on it, but no 1 on the odometer, it would say 29,000 miles. You've exceeded the mechanical limits of the odometer. So you'd say exceeded mechanical limits if you're being honest. Some people in the old days would actually buy a car brand new, drive it 150,000 miles, and then sell it and say the 50,000 is actual. Okay? And that's not odometer fraud in the sense that they didn't roll the odometer back, but it was fraud in the sense that they're committing fraud when they filled out the title that has that little section on it where it says, you know, I swear this is true, and you sign it and turn it in when you sell the car, right? So that was a form of odometer fraud, but it was not the same as odometer tampering. So what we're talking about is when people tamper with the odometer. And, you know, I'm old, okay? But in the old days, there's all kinds of crazy things people used to do. People used to actually, you could buy a device that would fit between the transmission and the sending thing that went up to the odometer. A lot of people never stop to think about this, but, you know, the odometer on your car doesn't actually have a sensor like on a wheel, like on a 10-speed bicycle that counts rotations or something. It actually usually takes the data from someplace else, like the transmission, and it just, you know, calculates based on what the transmission's doing to determine the speed of the vehicle and the odometer readings and so on. And there used to be a mechanical connection there. And you used to be able to buy a device. You'd see them advertised in the back of Popular Science. They'd say it was for testing only because it was obviously a violation of the law to use this thing. And I think they're illegal to sell now too, by the way. But I digress. And you'd put this device between the transmission and the odometer, and it would cause your odometer and your speedometer to read off by 1/2. So if you're doing 75 miles an hour, it would say you're doing 37.5 miles an hour. If you're doing 40, it read 20. And you say, well, what good does that do? Well, it also means if you drove 100 miles, the odometer would only read 50. And I know guys who drove a lot back in the old days who bought these devices for their vehicles because they didn't want to rack up all that mileage. And then when they go to sell the vehicle, they remove that device, stick it back together, and boom, they got a vehicle that actually only shows half the mileage that the vehicle was physically driven. So when we talk about the titles today, first of all, many people think that because there's a section on the title that says this vehicle is exempt from mileage reporting, or if it exceeds mechanical limits or something like that, that there are no more laws regarding odometers. So some states actually have a section on a title, and if a vehicle is over a certain age, they'll actually say, we no longer care about the mileage. And in many states, it's 10 years. So if a vehicle gets to be more than 10 years old, the title will actually say more than 10 years old. You just check that box. You don't need to fill in the mileage. I've had people tell me, they say, Steve, I don't need to worry about odometer tampering because that box was checked is over 10 years old. And I tell them, I say, by the way, though, you understand, and this works for both buyers and sellers, just because the vehicle is exempt from reporting or it's more than 10 years old doesn't mean it's legal to tamper with the odometer in it. The odometer law reads the same. Now, we'll get to that in a second also. Nowadays, I understand that modern cars, the odometer is not controlled by the thing I described to you a minute ago attached to the transmission. Not in that sense. Nowadays, we've got these control modules, electronic control modules, engine control modules, body control modules. There's all these different modules and computers and electronic devices underneath the hood of your car or in the firewall or someplace in there that controls a lot of the functions of your car. And one of the things that those devices also do is they record data regarding the engine and the mileage. So for instance, many vehicles nowadays, if you take it to a car dealership and say, guys, can you yank the data for me off of the control module and tell me what the actual mileage of my car is and how many times the starter has been cycled, they can tell you that because it counts every time the starter has been cycled. And it also records the mileage. And in fact, many modern odometers take their data from that source and simply put it on display in your dashboard. Now, there are also some instrument clusters. And again, every car company can do it differently, but I'm talking about the most common ways. But someplace in the instrument cluster on some of these vehicles is where the data is stored. But the data is stored, what I'm trying to get at here, someplace other than just the numbers on the dash. So it's not uncommon that people today will get in there and mess around with the number that displays on the dashboard. And that's easy to do with the internet nowadays. You can go on and find tools and things that allow you to do that. And for instance, there are some vehicles where you can simply take the instrument cluster out, throw it away, and put in a new one. And the new one starts at 0. But if the instrument cluster wasn't what was storing the data that was displayed there, that means there's going to be a data mismatch between the instrument cluster and the control module, for instance. And I've had a case before where a client of mine bought a vehicle, had some unusual problems for how low the mileage was, Took it to a dealer of that make and model car. And the first thing they did is they stuck in a reader to read the control module, and the guy comes back and he goes, yeah, there's a mismatch between your odometer and your control module. Guess which one is higher? And of course, the control module is higher, and the control module is likely correct. And in fact, after looking at it more carefully, we discovered that, yes, the instrument cluster on this vehicle had been replaced, and it looked like it had been replaced with one that simply read all zeros. So I can tell you, having spoken to people who work in the lending business and the leasing business, if you lease a vehicle and have it for 3 or 4 years, and at the end of the lease you turn it in, you know that you're only allowed to drive a certain number of miles, correct? Well, when they go to look at your mileage on your car, they're not going to stick their head and look at the dashboard and go, huh, the guy drove 45,000 miles. They're going to pop the hood or wherever they get access to the control module, stick in the reader, and find out what the actual mileage is. And in fact, a very good friend of mine, he's a relative, works at one of the companies in Michigan that's very well known for doing dash repairs and other things like that for car companies, leasing companies, and so on. And he told me that this industry is rife with people turning in vehicles, leases, and so on, where there are mismatches between the odometer and the control module. And they always are going the other direction. That is, the odometer reads lower. And what happens is somebody buys a vehicle, they get a lease, it's a low mileage lease, they find themselves driving way too many miles, and they wake up one morning, they do the math and go, okay, I'm going to owe so much per mile, times 1,000, times 10,000, whatever. Oh my gosh, I'm going to owe all this money. And somebody says, oh, you know, it's actually pretty easy to fix that dashboard number and make it lower and solve your problems. And so what happens is, next thing you know, they're trying to do that. And like I said, when they turn the vehicle in, the lending leasing company just simply plugs in the thing, goes, oh, there's a big odometer mismatch. And then, of course, the other problem is that now that there's an odometer mismatch, you've actually damaged the car to the point where it's been devalued by tens of thousands of dollars, maybe, depending on what kind of model of car it is, because they're going to have to repair the odometer to sell it legally. And they're also going to have to say the odometer has been repaired. And when you sell the vehicle to somebody after that and say the odometer has been replaced and repaired or whatever, the value takes a gigantic hit. So you don't want to do that. So there's a variety of issues that come up with odometer tampering. One is you don't want to be tempted to do it, even if it appears to be easy, because you'll get caught. And number two, you have to be aware that it could happen to you if you buy a vehicle that has a tampered odometer. So the first thing you need to do is when you look at a title on a vehicle and they're selling you a car and the title shows so many miles and they go, but don't worry, it's exempt, okay? Does not mean that the odometer can be tampered with. The odometer cannot be tampered with regardless if it's exempt or over 10 years old, okay? So you need to do things like check Carfax or a competitor. There's a bunch of different companies out there that track that data, whether it's Carfax or a competitor, it doesn't matter. But Carfax and those companies pick up mileage off of different events in a vehicle's history, and you want the mileage to always be heading north, okay? And that's one of the most common ways that people do catch odometer fraud these days is they'll say, by the way, that vehicle had 50,000 miles on it here, then it had 30,000, now it's got 60,000. Well, it doesn't go 50, 30, 60. So somebody must have tampered with it. Now, I will tell you, I spoke to somebody recently, called my office, said, Steve, weird problem. I'm the only owner of my car since its birth, first owner. And I brought it in religiously for oil changes because I went to sell it, and a car dealer pulled the Carfax and they go, dude, what'd you do with your odometer? And he said that the last oil change he took it to, the guy fat-fingered in the wrong number and took like 50,000 miles off the car. And he goes, well, no. Obviously, the oil change is done recently, but look at my mileage. And the guy goes, no, it doesn't matter. It's on the Carfax. You're screwed. So last I heard, he was contacting Carfax about getting that removed. And Carfax does have by the way, they do have a system in place where you can tell them about a discrepancy. And if you can prove the discrepancy is there, they'll fix it for you. They will. At least they told me they will, because I made some phone calls. But the point is that Carfax will often be what points this stuff out. But there's other things you can do. For instance, if you're buying a late model car that's got one of those control modules on it, you can take it to a dealer that sells those cars and go, guys, can you slap the reader on there and tell me how many miles are on the control module? Does it match the odometer? And if it does, you're good. If it doesn't, you got a problem. Mechanics will also tell you that you can look for things like signs of wear. A car with 30,000 miles on it will not have the same looking pedals that a car with 230,000 miles will have on it, because certain things wear out through use. Okay, so you're going to look for signs of wear and things of that nature to determine if a car's got less than 100 or over 100 and so on. Once you've done those things, you should also know that there are, like I said, a federal statute and a state statute in most states on odometer tampering. So if you ever discover you bought a car with an odometer mismatch, tampered odometer, altered odometer, anything like that, you can sue under a federal statute and you get actual damages plus $10,000, whichever is greater, plus attorney fees and court costs. But there's often state statutes that are better, and I'll explain this to you. Michigan's statute on odometer tampering not only is very, very broad, it says you cannot alter, set back, disconnect, or cause or allow an odometer to be altered, set back, or disconnected, but you don't have to prove intent. So in other words, if somebody owned a car and the mileage went the wrong direction, and they sell it to you, and you can prove it was in their possession when it happened, you're going to win an odometer tampering claim against them. You don't have to prove they did it on purpose. They didn't have to do it with intent. All you got to do is show it happened while in their possession, that they allowed an odometer to be altered, set back, or disconnected, because that does not happen on its own. Okay? So if it happened, you bought a vehicle, and the odometer appears to have been tampered with, contact an attorney in your state and discuss the federal statute and the state statute, because the statutes also allow you to get your attorney fees and your court costs paid. So I take good odometer cases all the time from people where I represent them and say, don't worry about your attorney fees. I'll get it from the bad guys. And the only thing we ever worry about, whether it's the attorney or the client, is whether or not the defendant is collectible. And that's the sad part, because I've had great odometer cases where I've sued somebody, I've won, I've gotten a judgment, and the person's not collectible. And we spend a couple of years chasing the person around, doing creditors' exams and, slapping liens on their stuff and so on, levying this and sending out court officers and bailiffs and sheriff's deputies. And it's a mess, and it's not a lot of fun for us or the person we're chasing, for that matter. But the statutes are extremely powerful, and they are on the books. So the takeaway from all of this today is, number one, understand that titles, even if they say it's exempt from reporting or beyond mechanical limits, they are still not allowed to roll the odometer back. And if you're selling a vehicle and you're tempted, don't do it, because it's a crime. But number two, remember that in modern cars, that data is always stored on a control module that can be checked. Someone can check it for you and find out if your vehicle is correct or not. And then finally, after you check Carfax and look for signs of wear and all those kinds of things, if it happens to you, federal statute, state statute, talk to an attorney. That's what you need to know about odometer fraud. Questions or comments, shoot my way, lehtoslaw.com, LEHTOSLAW.com. I'm on Twitter at Steve Lehto, at STEVELEHTO. And this show's on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, Google Play, and YouTube. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.